I'd like to introduce Dr. Brent Hughes from Sonoma State University. He runs the Hughes Marine Lab at that school and he'll tell you about how many of his students have received scholarships in this chapter. He attended Truman College, is that in Kansas?
Truman State University, it's in Missouri.
In Missouri.
Yeah.
Truman's area.
Yeah, Truman's
Yeah.
neck of the woods. Very true.
Got his bachelor's there. He got his master's at
Moss Landing Marine Labs.
Marine Labs down in the peninsula. And then his doctorate is at UC Santa Cruz, and he was also a post-doctoral candidate. He's published a number of papers, an enormous number of papers, in fact. And tonight, it took me 3 years to track down somebody that could speak about eelgrass, because one of the experts unfortunately died in a very sad car accident in her home in Petaluma and at the Marine Lab. So, and she was your mentor, and you're going to talk to her about it. But anyway, he's going to offer a very interesting program, so I'll turn it over to you. Anything I forgot?
No, that was great.
Good.
First of all, thank you for the invite to the Milo Baker chapter of the California Native Plant Society. As just mentioned, my students have really benefited from the Milo Baker chapter. I think I now have 8 students who have received the scholarship in the last 5 or 6 years since I started at Sonoma State, and I always encourage them to apply and think about it, because one, you all do incredible work, and that I believe you like supporting the students who I believe are doing incredible work too. This week, 3 of my students, 2 graduate students and 1 undergrad, received awards. And so it was a very good week in the lab. I don't know if you've ever been around one of these students when they've actually received the notice, but it can be life-changing for them to win an award, a scientific award. It really can kind of be a game changer in their careers. So for that, I really thank you all in considering my students too. Okay, so the title is a little strange probably for a bunch of native plant enthusiasts because it mentions predators. So I'm going to be telling you just kind of a little bit of a story of my journey in marine science, in particular marine plant science. That's kind of my background, but how that's kind of led to I think some big discoveries, at least and especially in our neck of the woods. And this right here, what I'm showing you is a food web. It's an estuary food web, and it has a lot of significance, in particular because recently we've added the sea otter to our estuarine food webs here in California. And that's a lot about what this story is all about. Okay, so we're going to start our journey. Okay. In a little estuary called Elkhorn Slough. Some of you are probably familiar with this estuary. It's right at the heart of Monterey Bay. Right now we're looking towards the Pacific Ocean, so due west. Just right outside the mouth there is the head of the Monterey Bay Submarine Canyon, a canyon that's deeper than the Grand Canyon. So there's a lot of things going on in the area, both from the ocean side of things, but also the land side of things. What you'll see on either side of the Elkhorn Slough there, which is just a meandering channel that connects to the ocean. One side on our right, which is the north, is fully protected. In fact, the Packard family from David Louis Seal Packard actually own that piece of property, and they've dedicated fully to conservation and protection. However, on the other side, you have a power plant, you have a fishing harbor, Moss Landing, you have agricultural fields. And these agricultural fields actually extend about 200 kilometers inland. This is what we call the Salinas Valley. A lot of the Salinas Valley, about half of it, drains actually into Elkhorn Slough. Now, it creates a lot of problems, unfortunately. And the problems are really, the big problem is nutrients, right? We typically think of nutrients as a good thing for plants. However, in the ocean, you can get too many nutrients in the system, and it can cause all these harmful things. In Elkhorn Slough, based on modeling and monitoring of the system, we know that about a dump truck of fertilizer gets into Elkhorn Slough every day. That's a lot of fertilizer for a tiny little estuary. And there's a little bit of irony here, because in the Salinas Valley, it's a $10 billion, $15 billion industry. We consider it the salad bowl, one of the salad bowls of the United States. It's growing a lot of leafy greens, strawberries, artichokes, Brussels sprouts, but lettuce. And so the irony behind this all is that the fertilizer that's used to grow lettuce on land ends up getting into Elkhorn Slough and grows seed lettuce, which is, there's a younger version of myself right there, Brent, about 15 years ago, with what I claim to be the largest specimen of seed lettuce ever discovered. I don't know if that's true, but when you go to Elkhorn Slough, it's a common feature. Is just it will cover the mud flats. It will cover. It will actually float on the surface and cover things. And so this is when you get too many nutrients. The seed lettuce is really good. It can uptake nutrients at a remarkable rate. And so it's usually just a kind of a species that you wouldn't even really notice. But if it has too much nutrients in the system, then it just forms these macroalgal blooms. Now, my background, when I went to Moss Landing Marine Labs, I got a degree in phycology, which is basically the study of seaweeds. So my background is all about marine botany. And so when I started working in Elkhorn Slough, I was really fascinated by this great mass of seaweed that was growing almost all year long. But I was also interested in the seagrass, and more of the seagrass, because the seagrass is really special. Seagrasses don't get a whole lot of attention compared to like kelp forests or coral reefs or mangroves. You don't really see them. Some people, when people do see them, they're like, ew, what's this gross plant touching my feet in the ocean? But they do remarkable things. They sequester carbon at tremendous rates that rival almost any ecosystem on the planet. They provide habitat for little baby fish, so they're considered fish nurseries, and also for invertebrates as well. They filter out contaminants, and then they protect shorelines from like wave erosion. So in Elkhorn Slough, when I started working on this problem of what we call eutrophication, which is basically too much nutrition, or when you get algal blooms, what was really kind of surprising to me was that the seagrass in Elkhorn Slough was looking really healthy. And the more I learned about it, it was actually in a state of recovery. And that almost defied all scientific logic and theory. Having that much of a nutrient load in the system, you, in theory, should not have seagrass. So this was an interesting thing for me, and I ended up doing part of my PhD on this exact question. So why else should we care about seagrass? Well, it's declining globally, so we're losing it. And in fact, the rate at which we're losing it is accelerating decade after decade. And so here in these graphs, there are just different regions of the globe. You find seagrass everywhere on every continent. And you'll see every single area, there's a global decline or a regional decline in seagrass. Today, I'm going to be talking about one species of seagrass. It's Zostera marina, which is basically our local seagrass. We have a couple other species, but this is the one that is really famous worldwide because it's also the biggest seagrass on the planet, meaning it grows the biggest, or grows the tallest, it has the biggest, fattest rhizomes. When it's functioning, it's almost like a mini forest rather than, you know, a prairie grassland or something like that. So I was really interested in figuring out, well, how does the seagrass compete with the sea lettuce? And when you get sea lettuce, you know, it can smother it out, the seagrass, and it can reduce photosynthesis and eventually cause dieback. But being a poor graduate student, my first step was start doing experiments in buckets because I can afford buckets. And so what I did starting off was very simple. I planted seagrass in these buckets. Some of them had this green lettuce, sea lettuce, and some of them didn't. And I just wanted to see how they were interacting and how that might influence the growth rates of the seagrass itself. However, I ran into a big problem when I started. Instead of kind of seeing all this neat interaction between these two species, I ended up growing a lot of this stuff, which these are diatoms. Diatoms are microscopic algae, very closely actually related to kelp. But they're single cells, but they can form chains. And when they form chains, they become macroscopic. And so what ended up happening is that unintentionally, I was getting all this diatom coverage that was kind of ruining my experiment. And so I tried several things like your common shade cloth that you could buy at a gardening store to shade out some of the light. So maybe it was too much light that was stimulating the diatoms. That didn't work. You know, I was kind of running out of solutions to run this experiment. And then I came across the paper that kind of changed my life. And here it is. The effects of nitrogen availability and herbivory on eelgrass, Zoster marina, and epiphytes, authored by Susan Williams, who, as we heard earlier, was the woman who was our local seagrass expert here in Sonoma County. Unfortunately, right before I got to Sonoma State, she passed away in a car accident. And so, yeah, so not a good thing. I came to Sonoma State after getting job offers from other places around the country. And I came here specifically to work on Susan. So she actually passed away about a week or two after I found out I got my job or received the job at Sonoma State. So anyways, she wrote with Mary Ruckelshaus this really important paper that describes these interesting animals and how important they are for the seagrass. And so there's two animals you see here. The one is a sea slug looking thing that's called Taylor's sea hare. And then the other one that looks like kind of a bug is just an isopod called the Idotea. And these animals do these incredible things where they are kind of these obligate animals that live in the seagrass. They're herbivores, but they don't eat the seagrass. All they do is eat the epiphytes that grow on the seagrass. So they're like little lawnmowers going up and down all day long, licking the seagrass clean. And so I was like, well, I got to put these animals in my buckets. And that's what I did. They licked my seagrass clean, and then they licked the buckets clean too. So these are actually my favorite animals. So a lot of people think that the sea otter is my favorite animal. No, these things are incredible. So, you know, this actually created this aha moment where it was like, okay, why are these sea slugs that we have in like super abundance in Elkhorn Slough, why do I go to other areas, other estuaries like Moss Bay or San Francisco Bay, and I just don't see them as big or as abundant? And then I started putting two and two together and started kind of going back and kind of retracing everything I knew about ecology, including the importance of the top predator. And in this case, Elkhorn Slough, sea otters had recovered recently recently being within the last 20 years of starting this study in Elkhorn Slough. And so we had all these data sets. We had data sets for the eelgrass and the sea otters dating back to the 1930s. We approached this in kind of a way where we could use all this available data, but then also do experiments in buckets, but also experiments where we would cage out the sea otters and to see what happened. And so after a couple of years, we think we really figured it out, and that the sea otters were driving what we call a trophic cascade, whereby what they eat can affect all the different food web components all the way down to the plants. And so I'm not going to show you every experimental result and all the results. This is basically the conclusion right here. So here in this situation, no sea otters or elkhorn slough before sea otters came back. The eelgrass was almost extinct. There was only about an acre left of eelgrass in the system in the 1980s, and then the sea otters came back. But what happens is that without the sea otters, and this is what the big connection we needed to make to try to see if sea otters were linked to the eelgrass, we had to figure out, well, what are they eating in the eelgrass? And it turns out to be red rock crabs, very similar to Dungeness. And these red rock crabs, if they're left without a predator of their own, they'll become the predator in the system, and they'll eat those sea slugs and those isopods. And so by removing all those, you get really, it's not the ulva or the sea lettuce that's affecting it, it's those epiphytes. And so you get epiphyte coverage on the seagrass, and that would cause the seagrass to be unhealthy and eventually die. You add in the sea otter, they eat all the crab. That frees the isopods and the sea hares to do their thing, and then you get healthy seagrass. And you might be thinking like, well, what? How, sea otter, what? How could they have this big effect? Well, the sea otter needs to eat 25% of its biomass every day to stay alive. These animals lack blubber. And so their way to live in cold water is that they're just eating all day. And so, a male could be about 100 pounds here in California. So a male's eating 25% or 25 pounds every single day of crab. And so about 15, 20 years, I enter Brent Hughes into Elkhorn Slough, and there's almost no more of these crab because the sea otters ate them all. They're remarkable predators based on what they eat, but also for science. They're the only marine predator that I know of, I challenge you to think of one, that will dive down to the bottom of the ocean, grab its prey, come back up, show you the prey, and then eat it. So we know exactly what these animals are eating at all times everywhere, because we have volunteers stationed all around the estuary observing them for up to 8 hours a day. So in terms of our understanding of a top predator, this is unprecedented on the entire planet. Nobody knows more about top predators than us sea otter biologists. So they're remarkable animals. This study was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science and has now become a textbook example of a trophic cascade. And so this image came from that textbook, Marine Biology by Castro and Huber.
If the sea otters eat all the crabs, what do they live on it?
Well, they're not dumb animals. So they'll deplete all the crab, and then they'll go switch to clams. Deplete all the clams, and they'll switch to some other species. And then they'll just keep doing that, and they'll let their prey recover. They will never drive a prey item to extinction. They'll just let it get low, and they'll move on to whatever's there. Yeah. That's right. And so I'm going to tell you more about what else they're eating in the system. There's a fun video that I worked on with PBS. It's only a 5-minute video for their Deep Look series, but it's called Sea Hares Scour Seagrass by the Seashore. And it's cool. I had a cinematographer credit on it. It won an Emmy Award. So check it out. I think it's a cool video. Kids love it, so show your kids. But anyways, back to the story. So what we've kind of discovered here is that sea otters are really heroes of the seagrass. Now, why are we just discovering this now in 2013? Well, as you might have known, sea otters were hunted to near extinction, especially here in California. Has anybody ever touched a sea otter pellet? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Smooth and silky, very dense with furs. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
It's the softest thing you'll ever touch. And the reason it's so soft and was so valuable, it's like gold back in the 1700s, 1800s, is the sea otter has 1 million hair follicles per square inch of skin. And that's another way it kind of keeps insulated from the cold temperatures. But because of that, they were driven to near extinction. And here on the upper left, those are some native Alaskans from the Aleutian Islands that were really expert hunters. They were actually enslaved by Europeans to go hunt the sea otter. You can see one of the hunters with some pelts. That's kind of the image on the bottom right. I don't know if you can see it too well. That's a drawing of a sea otter sketch. That's not very accurate. But luckily the sea otter didn't go extinct. There are animals that did go extinct, like Steller sea cow, which is on the top right, which used to be a mega herbivore of seagrasses and kelp. But they were wiped out by Europeans. One of the first things that was discovered about sea otters, and really that launched this whole line of research behind top predators and what they can do in ecosystems, came from the kelp forest. And this discovery was actually made in the Aleutian Islands in the 1970s, early 1970s, by a scientist from UC Santa Cruz named Jim Estes. And the food web is a lot simpler than what I was just showing you. There's really just 3 players. There's the sea otter, sea urchins, and then kelp. And sea urchins love to eat kelp. And so if there's no sea otters to control the urchins, then they can deforest kelp forest. And that was what the kind of thing, the big study that launched a lot of studies around the world, trying to figure out, like, hey, how common are these trophic cascades? So we already knew that sea otters were the heroes of the kelp forest. Now we discovered that they're also heroes of a totally different system in seagrasses and estuaries. And then it started getting really wild. As we're following seagrasses or the sea otters around these seagrass beds, we noticed something that nobody in science has ever observed, and that's them using salt marshes. And so it's almost like with this protection, sea otters are going kind of back towards more of these terrestrial type of environments, although you probably don't think a salt marsh is terrestrial. Marine ecologists might think it's kind of terrestrial lake, right? And a lot of this is all about kind of challenging old paradigms. A lot of ecology, modern day ecology started in around the 1930s. It really started taking off in the 50s and the 60s. And by that time, we have wiped out a lot of the top predators on the planet. And so we have these kind of skewed baselines, or what we call a shifting baseline of what animals should be in certain places, right? And so there's like things like harp seals that are known to be kind of more northern Arctic predators. That's one on a beach in like South Carolina. At dinner tonight, we were talking about sea wolves. Sonoma State, our mascot's the sea wolf, and I get a lot of people ask me, like, is that just some fantasy animal? And no, it's not. There's a sea wolf right there hanging out in the rocky intertidal on some fucus beds. They're really good predators in the ocean. And mountain lions, we're finding, don't need to just use mountains there. They'll actually use like savannas and stuff and grasslands. Orangutans using unforested areas. There's a jackal hunting sharks on a beach. River otters. River otters should also be called sea otters, I think, because they're incredible ocean hunters, ocean predators. So they operate in the rivers, but they were almost extirpated too in North America. And so a lot of these kind of what we thought where animals should be are kind of changing, and a lot has to do with conservation. So conservation of these large predators is starting to pick up. Okay. So, what we've done, we worked on this kind of question as a group. This paper that you see here came from a group of us scientists who are really interested in restoration. So a lot of what I do these days is science that's informing restoration. How do you do restoration? And a lot of us have started to recognize and appreciate that, wow, sometimes you don't, like with the case of the sea otter, you don't have to really do anything. The sea otter does all the work for you. And so we combed the literature of basically any restoration study that we could find that involved vegetation, either on land or in the water. And looking at kind of different factors, and you all would probably appreciate this, like herbivore exclusion. So building a fence around whatever plants you want to protect. Predator reintroduction, that's like introducing the sea otter. Facilitator inclusion, that's when you plant certain species that promote other species of plants. And then competitor removal, that's when you're removing the plants that you think are doing harm. And so if the further you are to the right, I'm not going to explain all this math and statistics, but basically the further you are to the right, the stronger the positive effect on the restoration itself. And so what we found was that introducing predators is one of the most powerful ways to restore vegetation. And that was published in the journal Science, which was funny that they put this animal on the cover of Science because we were a bunch of marine ecologists who published this paper, and then Science came out with it. They're like, you're going to be on the cover? We were all thinking they were going to put a sea otter on it, and they put this. We're like, what the heck is this thing? That is called a gerenuk. It's an African animal that you find in like the Serengeti. And it's been found if there's a lack of predators like lions and hyenas and stuff, that these things will just destroy vegetation. So kind of moving forward, back to the sea otter. So a lot of kind of what has caused these problems is that in the 20th century, our kind of worldview of what the true niche of the sea otter was super reduced because they were almost hunted to extinction. In California, there was about a period of 20 years where it was thought they were extinct. Does anybody know where they were found? They were rediscovered off the coast of Big Sur. And if you've ever been to the coast of Big Sur, it kind of makes sense, right? It's hard for humans to get to. Even now, it's like hard for us to get to the coast of Big Sur. So they were found on the outer coast of Big Sur, around kelp forest. And because of that historical accident, we had just thought of them as kelp forest animals. So our 20th century idea or concept of the sea otter was very reduced. There you can see the historic, and that's native indigenous knowledge, right? And so the native indigenous people knew everything about the sea otters, where they were living, where they were hunting, or where they were feeding, because they needed to. They needed to kind of be able to manage sea otters. A lot of that knowledge has been wiped out. So we didn't, it's been wiped out from existence, basically. So fast forward to now, right here, I've highlighted two estuaries in particular, Elkhorn Slough and Morro Bay. Within the current range of sea otters in California, there's really only those two major estuaries. But there's two or several estuaries just north of that we think would provide not only the sea otter a new home, but also might provide ecosystem benefits, especially at a place like San Francisco Bay, where we think the eelgrass is there, but it might be just a small, tiny fraction of what used to exist. However, San Francisco Bay has a lot of risks, right? And I'll talk to you a little bit about those risks. So we're also looking at other estuaries where the risk might not be so great, like Drake Sestero and Point Reyes. So anyways, another thing you might be thinking, going back to the seagrass example, is like, hey, this is one study done in Elkhorn Slough. Does this apply anywhere else in the world? And so we actually repeated this study, but in a much larger system of Southeast Alaska, where sea otters are recovering at a tremendous rate. And the difference between Elkhorn Slough in southeast Alaska. Elkhorn Slough has about 20 hectares, 21 hectares of seagrass. This has 20,000 kilometers squared of seagrass. And so, and what we found, and this part of this research has already been published. The lead author on this paper is Wendell Raymond, who is got his head face down in the grass, which is often what we're doing. Like, I'm sure you all do vegetation surveys and counts. Like, we do that, but it's underwater. And so, but what you see here is a sea otter index, which it has a lot of different components to it. But basically, the greater the index, the more sea otter effects there are, the more sea otters there are. And so this is just above ground biomass of seagrass as a function of sea otter index in southeast Alaska. So we now have evidence that, yeah, they're promoting seagrass in a whole different kind of environment. Same species of eelgrass though, Zostera marina. All right, so that does it for the seagrass. Now this salt marsh thing. So as we're following these sea otters and they're just kind of revealing themselves to us in their true niche breadth, we started seeing them use this habitat that nobody's ever seen them use before. And so I call this predator reoccupation of a novel habitat. They probably used salt marshes before that the Europeans came here and wiped out traditional knowledge. So anyways, what I'm going to show you is a sea otter foraging in the banks of the salt marsh. This was filmed using a GoPro, just on a stick, on a PVC pole. No humans around. And so there, the sea otter is munching on crab. It's feeding on a different species of crab here. It's a shore crab. They're much smaller than the red rock crab. And it's interesting, the sea otter has like a little flap of skin on its chest. And so it can dive down in the smaller prey items. They can just stuff it in this kind of little pouch thing. And then it will go back to the surface because it can't eat underwater. And then it will just eat these things like popcorn. And it's fast. It's like, it just ate 10 crabs? That was like the fastest thing. And so anyways, the otter, as you saw, it went back down. It's picking more of these crabs out. And what we've kind of are obviously interested in for several reasons is the salt marsh in Elkhorn Slough. This is pickleweed salt marsh or Salicornia. It is suffering. It's eroded away. About 50% of it has eroded away. And where does it erode away? Well, it erodes away right at the edges. And there's been a ton of work on the East Coast about how crabs can destabilize banks of shorelines. And this crab in particular, not only does it burrow, which destabilizes the shoreline, but it loves eating the roots of the pickleweed itself. And so it's doing this destabilizing thing. And then I was just putting kind of knowledge from all these different systems together and putting two and two together. And then the result was that we found another trophic cascade. This one is a little bit simpler than the seagrass. It's kind of almost like the kelp example, whereby sea otters consume all these crabs. And so when they're done going through all the red rock crabs and the eelgrass, they'll switch over to these crabs. They'll eat on these crabs for a year or two, let the red rock crabs recover, and then they'll go back to the red rock crabs, and then they'll go to the clams. I mean, they're really intelligent animals. And so what we found is that they not only support all the below ground biomass of the rhizomes and the roots, but they actually not stop erosion, but they slow it down. They cut it down by half the rate. This turned into a big deal and got the cover of Nature, who did get it right. This time they put sea otters on there. And so good for them. So that was a big result. That was published last year. It only took 12 years to do the research. Okay, so now we're following sea otters in the salt marshes. And good gosh, what do we notice? They start eating, this is the back parts of the estuary, we're not far away from any kelp forests. And so these are truly estuarine animals. And so we're going back from all our salt marsh work one day. We're loading the boat on, getting it out of the water. And we spotted this one sea otter eat about 30 of these green crabs in about 20 minutes. These are European green crabs. They're an invasive species. They're highly destructive. They eat our local oysters, our native oysters. They eat all sorts of things and destabilize food webs, and they're expanding at a tremendous rate. What we've discovered recently, and I didn't put the paper up, it was published like 3 months ago, but what we found is that sea otters can basically stop their invasion just through their consumption of the European green crab. So this is interesting because it's like, sea otter has never seen this species of crab. It didn't mind. It's eating them anyways. So what we have now is this novel rediscovered coastal food web, and it's kind of novel, not because the Native Americans didn't know about it, but we're getting things like invasive species that are now kind of thrown into the mix. So it's all been very exciting. Now, sea otters in California, from the Life article. So this picture came from Life magazine, 1938, when the big announcements were coming out about the rediscovery of the extinct sea otter. 50 animals. We're now 2025, and we're at 3,000 in California, which sounds pretty good, but it's not. It's still, the sea otter is still an endangered species. And the population, its current range, it's basically at carrying capacity, which means you can't really put more animals in the region between Santa Barbara and San Francisco because they maxed it out already. So there's only two places to really go, right? North or south. And the sea otter has really struggled to get past the north or south because of great white sharks. And so there's this thing called the great white shark gauntlet that they just can't get beyond. And so, we're trying to figure out, well, what are sea otters doing for the estuaries, but also what are the estuaries doing for sea otters? And so here are two examples here. One comes from Alaska. On the top graph, in Alaska, around the Aleutians, the killer whales are the big predators of the sea otter. Especially, there's a huge thing going on where the killer whales have basically decimated a lot of the seal populations to the point where they're kind of forced to eat sea otters, and that's not their preferred item. And they're not very, nutritious compared to a big fat like sea lion or seal. But what we've discovered is that as the sea otter population has crashed in Alaska, there's in the Aleutian Islands, there's actually one significant estuary called Clam Lagoon. It's actually one of the biggest seagrass beds in the world. And this little tiny lagoon in the Aleutian Islands is actually supporting more sea otters than the entire outer coast. And so that's it in red. So these estuaries are really important for refugia from predators. And we're seeing a similar thing in Central California too. We have a flatlined outer coast population, but the elkhorn slough population just keeps going up. So now we're like, okay, this might be a win-win. What about San Francisco Bay? So San Francisco's Bay is interesting because in most of the coast, we have actually a really good record of how many sea otters were in certain areas because these hunters took meticulous records. Like, how many pelts did you harvest today? And there was a great book by a woman named Adele Ogden, who wrote this book in 1937 called The Sea Otter Trade from 1784 to 1848. It has all the greatest details about the big hunt. And one of the quotes in that book, it came from a Spanish hunter that basically described San Francisco Bay when they first kind of were getting involved in the sea otter hunt as being in the bay from San Francisco to the estuary of Santa Clara, now down near San Jose, right? the ground appeared covered with black sheets due to the great quantity of otters which were there. And those are just the otters creating their floating rafts, right? Just look like black sheets because there were so many of them. We think there were about 10,000 in San Francisco. Currently in California, there's 3,000 sea otters. So that might, put that into a bit of perspective. So a lot has happened in San Francisco Bay. And we were curious about, well, what is modern day San Francisco Bay and all its habitats and prey? How, if we kind of took all that together and can we make a prediction on how many sea otters currently, the current San Francisco Bay could support? Because, it's a very urbanized, it's a totally different system than it was 200 years ago. And so we have the capability to do this now, and we can project forward. And so and this is the model, the projection model. It doesn't look super spectacular. But what we found was that San Francisco Bay currently could support about 6,000 sea otters, which would triple the California population. And it would raise it out of endangered species status. So we think it's an important place to consider for sea otter relocation, if that were to occur. However, San Francisco Bay has a lot of risks. So the previous map, that's just the map of all the habitats. The sea otters would definitely be more closer to shore than kind of out in the middle of the bay, although they would use the whole thing. But there's, as the darker red it gets, the more sea otters you would get. But so this is now a totally different paper and totally different story. These are the risks for sea otters in San Francisco Bay, and that's shipping, boating, pollution, all these factors we put in the model and mapped it out. Yeah.
What would they eat?
They would eat the same thing that they were eating in Elkhorn Slough: crabs, clams, mussels. What's that?
There's that much in the bay.
Yeah. There's a bunch in the bay. Yes, indeed. Yeah. And the green crabs too. Yeah. Yeah. They have the whole thing. They have everything the sea otter needs. But there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk associated. And so conservation-wise, it would be a huge potential benefit. But again, the risks are something to be considered. So because of that, we're looking at estuaries outside of San Francisco Bay to the north, Point Reyes, especially. And we're looking at what those systems might be able to offer. Here's what so here's me catching crab. We catch crabs in the marsh, and we catch crabs with crab traps out in the water. On the right hand is where you see what the crab populations look like. The two left ones are, the furthest left is Drake's Estero. So the higher it is, the more crab there are, basically. Drake's Estero is loaded with crab, and green crab too, but loaded with crab. San Francisco Bay, not as great, but way higher than the two estuaries, Morro Bay and Elkhorn Slough, that currently have sea otters. So we think, and we know actually that these systems would support sea otters, and it might be nice because there's not that human dimension so much in a place like Drake's Estero, a little bit more in Moss Bay, but there's plenty of food and there's plenty of habitats. And yeah, you wouldn't get 6,000 sea otters. We think Moss Bay and combined with Drake's Estero would probably support about 250 sea otters, but without the risk, as much of the risk. So,
is there potential for them then to move from Point Reyes down into San?
yeah, oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's still going to be shark. I mean, that whole area between Santa Cruz out to the Fairlawns to Moss Point is the red triangle. So, there's still going to be the predation thing that they would have to deal with. But yeah, great question. So now we are thinking about kelp. And how it relates to the sea otter and sea otter recovery. Now, kelp, a photosynthetic organism that grows these massive forests, we lost about 90% of it on the Northern California coast in the last 10 years. Gone. A lot of it has been due to the loss of the top predators, historically sea otters, and then there was this really significant predator sea star called the sunflower star. It gets about this big. They're really important predators. We lost those to a wasting disease that wiped out almost all the sea stars on the entire coast from Baja to Alaska. Those stars haven't recovered. The sea otters haven't come back. So that's led to basically this urchin-barren state where a lot of the kelp has been lost. So that's what I'm working on currently, is how do we restore that without these predators? So the idea being like, well, eventually sea otters can make it here, but it could be a long time, right? And so we got to kind of think up, outside of, just put in sea otters, that might not even be possible. And we really are kind of trying to save this ecosystem from going extinct. So we have to use our own means. And what we do is, ironically, there's a bajillion urchins out there in Marin and Sonoma County and in Mendocino County. But they're kind of like empty shells now. They have no gonads. It's primarily because there's no kelp to eat. And they can go dormant for a very long time. They're almost like zombies. So these people who have historically fished for them, the commercial urchin fishery, they're kind of out of a job right now. And so what we've been doing is just working with them and employing them. They go harvest urchins, and then this guy here in his lab, we grow the kelp and outplant it to certain areas after all the urchins have been removed. And it's not a simple process. This is not like eelgrass where I can just take eelgrass and then use a garden staple and put it somewhere else. Here you can see us growing our baby kelps. You can see they're just like these little tiny sprouts coming. Right now you're looking down a PVC tube with twine wrapped around it. And the kelp is growing on twine. And so we grow it on twine for about a couple months till we can macroscopically see it. And then we spool it out on rope that's been secured to the bottom of the ocean. And we suspend the rope because we don't want the urchins climbing up and eating it all. So here we are in the initial stages of kelp forest restoration. This was done in Albion Cove in Mendocino County. So that was roughly, this is gonna be crazy, but this is May 2023. These are about this, they're about this big now. Here we are in August 2023. And our kelp has grown about 20 or so feet. This kelp, bull kelp, grows a foot a day. It's one of the fastest growing photosynthetic organisms on the planet. They're annuals. And so you can see they're suspended on ropes. They actually, the whole fast goes over the rope. And then the bull kelp itself actually has a float called a pneumatocyst that's gas filled. So it just grows to the surface. So that was August, just after a couple months. Here's December. Now it's all the way up to surface. And now it's putting out their blades, which have the reproductive sora, which have all the spores. And that's what we want. We actually don't want to grow forest on ropes. I mean, how unsustainable is that? We actually want them to be producing the spores that's going to be the next generation. And there's the sorrel patch, the dark patch that has all the spores. Billions of spores. And so we went from that little tiny thing to this massive thing in a few months. That's Albion Cove. Okay, folks. Well, I'm wrapping up here. I have to thank, this kind of work takes a village. I'm usually the one in the water, and then you need people out counting the sea otters and seeing what they're eating, and then you have all the students and the ecosystem managers. There's my mentor Susan. It was a picture taken right before she died in Indonesia. She did a lot of work on seagrass restoration in Indonesia. So I couldn't do any of this stuff by myself. Thank you, Milo Baker chapter of the California Native Plant Society. You're supporting those students right there. I couldn't thank you enough. And then lastly, if you're ever in the town of Moss Landing, look out for sea otters crossing the road because they're doing that now. In fact, they've had to put speed bumps and signs to slow people down. So, because a sea otter was hit a couple years back. So they're literally moving onto land. And then the last thing is, we just came out, and I think this for this crowd will be interesting. We've actually, on top of all that sea otter stuff we were doing, we're actually restoring seagrass in the estuary itself to give it a bump. The seagrass is now back to historical levels of coverage. We were able to have really high success for seagrass restoration, and then we've been doing it in San Francisco Bay, and Susan was doing it. We learned everything from Susan. So we wrote a manual on how to restore seagrasses. And this is for a lay audience. It's not for a scientific audience. It's for anybody around the world who wants to restore seagrass. It's not rocket science. And, you know, you're little garden staples, or you're collecting seeds and dispersing seeds. It's actually something that anybody can do. So we wrote this manual on how to restore seagrasses. We made a video series. And so this is where I was able to channel my inner Julia Child, one of my heroes, and I wish we would have called this the art of seagrass restoration, but we didn't. We gave it that title. But we even have an accompanying video series about showing about 5 or 6 different techniques of restoring seagrass. And so if you're ever interested, Anthropocene or Anthro-Ocean, there's my website too. So thank you. Yeah.
My high school students always ask me, is it possible to restore sea otters along the coast of Sonoma County? And what would that take?
Yeah, it is.
Brent, would you mind repeating the question?
Yes. So the question was, can we restore sea otters in Sonoma County? The answer is yes. The site selection is the challenging part. What we know about sea otter and restoring sea otters is that it's best to put them in a system that has food and has their habitat. So there's not a ton of estuaries in Sonoma County, right? You know, it's like Bodega Bay. So the probability of starting a relocation effort and starting with Sonoma County is probably unlikely compared to Marin County and Mendocino County. Like, that's just the honest truth. There's more estuaries, there's bigger estuaries. But that doesn't mean sea otters wouldn't end up in Sonoma County really quickly after that happened. And Elkhorn Sloughs benefited from this great program by the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where they take in stranded juvenile sea otters, have a surrogate mother, they're like grandmothers, who through just altruism teach these juveniles how to be sea otters and how to eat and dive and forage, and then the aquarium puts them right back out in the ocean, and they put them back in Elkhorn Slough because they know that's going to have the most food. There's not going to be white sharks. There's going to be the habitats they need. And like for a salt marsh, think about it. If you're a sea otter in a kelp forest, you're a mother, you have your pup, you need to put your pup on a kelp bed and leave it and dive down for a couple minutes or so, and to about 50 or 60 feet, and then come up, and then, you know, the pup might, who knows where it's at. In Elkhorn Slough, the mother, all it has to do is leave it on the salt marsh, has like a nice fluffy pillow, and then it dives down a foot. And then it comes back up with plenty of food. So it's these habitats are just good for promoting healthy sea otter populations. So likely it would be Drake's Estero to Moss Bay in the south. Up north, it might be around like Fort Bragg area, Big River, Noyo River, some of these areas. Probably not Noyo because there's a big harbor there, but around there. And then Oregon, there's a big push in Oregon right now to bring sea otters back. So things are kind of happening. The current administration, federal administration, is going to be a challenge though. At least maybe in the next couple of years, it might not happen. But we've made a lot of momentum towards perhaps relocating sea otters. Yeah. Oh. No, go ahead, yeah. So, yeah, so copies of the so here is the link to the manual itself. If you email me, I'll just send it to you. And so, that's good. We haven't this is like hot off the press, so hot that we haven't even printed it yet. So, and we don't even know if we're gonna print it. It just might be we just might make it available as PDFs. Yeah.
Do otters have an obstacle coming from the north and south from the Washington?
Yeah, so there's the Washington population that is out on the Olympic Peninsula primarily. The big obstacle, there's big stretches that coastline from Olympic Peninsula down to here, it's very rugged. So there's a challenge just in that. It's a lot more wild and dangerous than even our coast. But then there's large stretches where it's just sandy beach. And that's not good habitat for sea otters. It's awful habitat. They don't even use it. And so if you have 100 kilometers of sand, then that's a big kind of stretch for the sea otter to go through. So yeah, that's probably one of the big reasons. We do every once in a while get sea otters in San Francisco Bay, or there's been sea otters in Humboldt Bay. And so it's just kind of like it's not random. It's about almost every year an otter will show up. You're like, where it came from? Usually the otters that we see pop up around here came from Monterey. They're usually males who are just usually juvenile males that don't have like a harem of females and are just kind of wandering and searching. And so they do occasionally come up here, but it doesn't matter if you have a male come up here. A male's not going to restart a population. So you need females. Yeah.
So is the seagrass that is along our coast, is that the same as what's like in the Caribbean?
No. And so I was just in the Caribbean last week, and their seagrass is tiny compared to our seagrass. Like the biggest grass is turtle grass. It's about this tall. Our eelgrass, there's eelgrass in Moss Bay that's 10 feet tall, just right outside Nick's Cove. So this is big differences between tropical and temperate. Big differences in terms of size, especially. Yeah. They do. And that's the other problem, right? That I didn't even mention. I should have mentioned it. It's an important problem to mention, is that there's the concern with the crab fishery, and justifiably, oh yes, they will eat the Dungeness crab. In Monterey, we actually haven't seen a negative effect on the crab fishery, because we think, unlike places like Alaska, where a lot of the crabbing areas and areas where sea otters are quite shallow, out here, where you find the big adult Dungeness, they're typically beyond the dive limits of the sea otter. So we actually don't even think it's a big concern. But if you're a fisherman these days, especially, you would have to be concerned. So, I'm not trying to promote the sea otter necessarily, but I think the big step forward, especially for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who is tasked with ensuring that these animals recover under the Endangered Species Act, is to work with the fishermen and figure out solutions, either through mitigation steps, or anything that might be able to support them if sea otters were to recover. I think do you have a question back there? Yeah, it's happening right now. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Are we seeing river otters and sea otters kind of co-inhabiting areas? And the answer is it's just happening kind of now. We see it definitely up in Alaska and British Columbia. You see a lot more than you do here, but the river otters are just about, they're now reached all the way down to Monterey. They're kind of marching from the north to the south. And so And they will use the same habitat and they will eat the same things. The only big differences are river otters can hunt fish. Sea otters are horrible fishermen. They almost all only eat invertebrates. The other thing is that from a competition perspective, the sea otter is male sea otter 100 pounds, male river otter 35 pounds. So do the math, and the sea otter would beat up the river otter. Yeah, that's right. Oh, we don't even know. I think there's people out there, colleagues who are monitoring it, primarily sediments and water. I don't think there hasn't been, I don't think a study or an attempt to figure out if the sea otters or the harbor seals were contaminated. No, we haven't seen any sort of die-offs there. So that's good. Yeah. Yes.
So if the otters go in and wipe out an invasive crab, are they gonna then leave them alone so they can rebuild the population? Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if you've read, like, we work, one of the co-authors of that paper we wrote on the green crabs, his name's Ted Groschholtz. And he was with UC Davis, he's semi-retired, but they had a big project out at Bolinas Lagoon, trying to eradicate green crabs from Bolinas. And what they actually found, and they're such sweethearts for actually publishing this, is that the more they tried to eradicate it, the worse they were making it. And I can't remember exactly how that worked, but they were basically calling themselves out as very ineffective at eradicating. And then the sea otter comes around. It didn't, there's still green crab in Elkhorn Slip. And so it reduces that invasion effect. So you probably won't get total wipeout of the European green crab population, unfortunately. Yeah, they are. They're very cute animals.
Absolutely fascinating.
Oh, hey, thank you. All right. Thank you so much. Well, it's great giving these talks to groups like this, because I know everybody's going to be interested and alert and awake and paying attention and get excited about it. Other than, I teach at 1 o'clock, so right after lunch, so you know what can happen then. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you.